Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with NEXGROW. You know how we do things around here, always looking for the most fascinating reports to really dig into.
Absolutely.
So today we have a big one coming straight from the Standing Senate Committee on Transport and Communications.
Oh, wow. The Senate, huh?
Yep, and it's called, get this, Impacts of Climate Change on Critical Infrastructure in Canada.
I mean, that sounds pretty crucial.
It is. They've gone all out for this, interviewing experts, traveling across the country.
Really getting into the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. So we're going to break down what they found, focusing on, well, how climate change is going to shake up how we get around Canada.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize how vulnerable our transportation systems really are.
It's true. And when we hear that term, critical infrastructure, we tend to think of the obvious things, right? Roads, bridges, power lines, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the physical stuff, the things we see every day.
Right. But this report takes a much broader approach.
Oh, how so?
Well, they're using the definition from Public Safety Canada, which is any process or system, really, that's essential for our health, safety, or the economy.
So basically, the things that keep Canada running.
Exactly. It's a lot bigger than just potholes and traffic jams. So what are they actually worried about then?
Well, you got to think about it. Canada's economy, well, it heavily relies on moving goods and people all over the place.
Right, coast to coast to coast.
Exactly. But a good chunk of our infrastructure is, let's just say, not exactly young anymore.
Getting a little tricky.
Yeah, some of it's 50 years old or even older. So we're talking about a system that's, already showing its age, and now it has to deal with the wild card of climate change.
It's like we're trying to drive a classic car on a road full of potholes and detours.
It's a pretty good analogy. And the report doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. They say that almost 40% of our infrastructure is in fair or poor condition. And get this, the estimated cost to fix it all is about $90 billion.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It is, and it's leading to some tension. See, municipalities own about 60% of public infrastructure.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, but they often depend on the feds, the federal government, for funding these big, expensive projects.
I see. So it's a bit of a tug of war?
Kind of, yeah. It's a tricky situation.
Okay, so aging infrastructure plus a climate crisis. It does sound like a recipe for, well, some serious trouble. What kind of impacts are we actually talking about here?
So the report paints a pretty stark picture, and they highlight another report, Canada's top climate change risks.
And who put that one out?
That's from the Council of Canadian Academies, and it shows just how different the effects of climate change are going to be across the country.
Yeah, Canada's huge, so it makes sense that different regions will be hit in different ways.
Absolutely. So up north, for instance, you have thawing permafrost, you have melting ice.
Which I imagine makes things really difficult for communities there.
Especially for Indigenous communities and really anything built on that land. Then on the coasts, you've got rising sea levels and erosion.
Which threatens coastal communities and, of course, any transportation networks along the coast.
Exactly. And even in the Great Lakes, the water levels are changing, which can mess with shipping routes and make things unpredictable.
So basically, no matter where you are in Canada, there's something to be concerned about when it comes to climate change and transportation.
It's true. And I think the most important thing to remember is that our transportation system, well, it's all interconnected.
Right, like one big complicated web.
One disruption can have a ripple effect through the whole thing.
That makes a lot of sense. So what are the experts saying needs to be done?
The consensus is clear. We need to get serious about preparing for these impacts and building resilience into our systems, and we need to do it now.
I think it'd be helpful to get into some specifics. The report highlights some really interesting case studies.
Oh, yeah. They're fascinating.
Let's start with the Chignecto Isthmus. Where is that, and why is it so important?
Okay, so picture this. A narrow strip of land that connects New Brunswick and Nova Scotia.
Seems simple enough.
It is, except for one thing. It's the only road and rail link between those two provinces.
Oh, wow. So everything going between them has to cross that narrow little strip of land.
Pretty much.
That seems like a pretty big vulnerability.
It is. And here's the thing. It's basically this low-lying piece of land that's separating the Bay of Fundy from the Northumberland Strait. And all that's protecting it is this network of dikes.
Dikes. How old are those?
Some of them have been around for centuries.
Centuries? Wow. Okay, that sounds a little fragile, to be honest.
It is. And it's facing two major threats. First, rising sea levels. We're talking about projections of a 1-meter rise by 2100.
That's a lot of water.
Yeah, it is. And then you've got the storms, which are getting more frequent and more intense all the time. It all puts so much pressure on those old dikes.
So if those dikes fail, what happens?
Well, the report says a flood there could disrupt something like $35 billion in goods and services every year. Yeah. And that includes everything, propane shipments that are used for heating to, well, pretty much all kinds of trade that goes through the port of Halifax.
Okay, so that's not just an inconvenience. That's a major economic hit. What about the people who actually live in that area?
It's serious. Take the town of Amherst, Nova Scotia, for example. They could have up to 25 to 33% of their town underwater.
That's a huge chunk of the town.
Yeah, it's scary. And the report is upfront about it. It doesn't shy away from the potential human cost of this.
It does seem like we're looking at a potential disaster, and it's just unfolding slowly.
Yeah.
But are there any potential solutions?
There are, yeah. They've been looking at all kinds of things, everything from building higher dikes to, well, trying to use nature to help them out, like restoring wetlands, which can actually act as a natural buffer against those storm surges.
So kind of fighting nature with nature.
In a way, yeah. They're even considering creating a national park in the area, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Using nature as a tool to adapt to climate change. That's a pretty cool approach.
Yeah.
But there's also a legal battle going on about who's responsible for all this, right?
That's right. That's another layer of complexity to this whole situation. Nova Scotia is actually suing the federal government to try to figure out who pays for protecting this isthmus. And the estimates for that protection, we're talking $650 to $700 million. It's a lot of money.
That is a lot, and it sounds like nobody wants to be stuck with that bill.
Not really, no.
And this all ties back to that tension you were talking about earlier, right? Who foots the bill for these massive infrastructure upgrades? It's a tough question, especially with climate change adding so much uncertainty.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think this situation really highlights the kind of challenges we're up against. It's not just about finding solutions, it's about navigating all these political and financial realities.
It's a lot more complicated than just saying, hey, we need to fix this bridge. Okay, so we've got this vulnerable land link on the East Coast, but the report also takes us up north. What are some of the climate challenges in Canada's vast northern territories?
Oh, the North is a whole different ballgame, and climate change is already hitting them hard. Think about this. The North makes up something like 40% of Canada's landmass.
It's massive.
It is, but less than 1% of the population lives there.
Wow, so it's sparsely populated and facing some huge climate challenges.
Exactly. And a lot of the population in the North are Indigenous peoples, and their communities rely on a transportation system that's unlike anywhere else in the country.
So what's unique about transportation in the North?
Well, think ice roads. These are literally roads built on frozen lakes and rivers.
I've heard of those. That's amazing.
It is, and they actually make up 35% of the Northwest Territories highway system.
Wow.
Yeah, it's essential up there. And then there are winter trails and, of course, a lot of reliance on air travel. It's a whole system that's designed for a very specific climate, and that climate is changing fast.
Yeah, I can imagine that causes some major problems.
Absolutely. The ice road seasons are getting shorter, which impacts remote communities and makes it harder to get supplies in and out. It also affects industries like mining.
That makes sense. What about air travel? How's that affected?
Well, a lot of the airports up there have gravel runways built on permafrost, and as the ground thaws, those runways become unstable.
Oh, I see. That's a big problem.
Yeah, it leads to tons of delays and cancellations. The report actually mentions one airline, Canadian North, that has to cancel something like 175 flights per month because of the weather.
Wow, that's a huge disruption.
It is. It really isolates communities, delays essential supplies, and drives up costs for everything.
Yeah, that all makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the impact of wildfires? I know those have been getting worse in recent years.
Absolutely. Wildfires are a major problem in the North, and they're becoming more frequent and intense due to, you guessed it, climate change.
Yeah, and they not only damage infrastructure directly, but also force evacuations, right?
Exactly. They make it extremely dangerous to travel.
So it sounds like the North is really bearing the brunt of climate change impacts in Canada, at least when it comes to transportation. Yeah. What does the report say needs to happen to make things better up there?
Well, they're pretty clear about it. We need a serious investment in building more resilient infrastructure. That means things like roads that can withstand thawing permafrost, better port facilities, and airport runways that are less vulnerable to the changing climate.
Yeah, it seems like a whole different approach to infrastructure is needed in the North.
It is. It's a whole different set of challenges.
And I would imagine that traditional knowledge would be incredibly valuable in finding solutions.
Oh, absolutely. Indigenous peoples have been living and adapting to that land for centuries.
Their knowledge of the environment is invaluable.
Exactly. They can really help us understand how things are changing and how to adapt in a way that works for the North.
I think that's a key takeaway from all of this. Climate change impacts are different everywhere, and we need to be thinking about solutions that are tailored to the specific needs of each region.
You got it.
Okay, so we've seen the impact on a crucial land link and in those remote northern communities. Now, I want to shift gears and head to a place that's a bit more familiar, a bustling transportation hub that many of us know, Vancouver. What makes this city so vulnerable to climate change?
Vancouver is all about connections, right? It's a gateway to the Pacific with the Vancouver International Airport and the Port of Vancouver. They handle an incredible amount of cargo and passengers.
Yeah, it's a busy place.
It is, and they're all connected by this complex web of roads, railways, and waterways. But all those connections also mean more points of vulnerability when it comes to climate change.
So what are the biggest threats to Vancouver's transportation system?
The biggest one, without a doubt, is rising sea levels. Did you know that the Vancouver International Airport is actually built on an island?
No, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's called Sea Island, and it's protected by a system of dikes. But those dikes are at risk from rising sea levels, and then there's the added threat of storm surges, which could overwhelm the dikes and flood the whole airport. Even the port itself, which is built to be pretty tough, is connected to the mainland by roads and rail lines that are vulnerable to flooding.
And we saw what can happen when those connections are disrupted.
You're talking about the 2021 atmospheric river.
Yeah, that was a pretty dramatic event.
It was. It caused massive flooding and landslides, which basically shut down the entire region's transportation network for over a week.
I remember that. The images were pretty shocking.
They were, and the economic impact was staggering, something like $840 million per day in lost cargo movement.
It's crazy to think about the ripple effect of something like that. It
Yeah.
really highlights how vulnerable we are to these kinds of events.
It does, and the report also talks about the impact on Indigenous communities in that area. They rely on the ocean for food and their livelihoods, and climate change is disrupting that, especially when it comes to salmon.
So it's not just about economics, it's about people's cultures and their way of life. It's clear that climate change adds a whole other layer of complexity to an already complicated system. So what needs to happen to make Vancouver's transportation network more resilient?
The report puts a lot of emphasis on collaboration. You've got all these different players, municipalities, Indigenous communities, the airport authority, the port authority. They all need to be working together, sharing information, and coordinating their efforts.
It sounds like it's not just about building bigger and stronger infrastructure.
Right. It's about being smarter and more collaborative in how we plan for these challenges.
And recognizing that climate change is an ongoing challenge that we need to be constantly adapting to.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've seen how climate change is affecting the coasts, the north, and this major transportation hub. What's our final stop on this deep dive?
Let's head to the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway system. It's a massive waterway, about 3,700 kilometers long, that connects the heart of North America all the way to the Atlantic Ocean.
Wow, that's a vital artery for trade and transportation.
It is. But climate change is impacting it in some really complex ways. On one hand, climate change is actually leading to longer shipping seasons because there's less ice cover. That's good for the economy and could actually help reduce emissions because ships can be used instead of trucks for a longer period of time.
So that's a positive side effect. But there must be some downsides too, right?
There are. We're seeing lower water levels in the St. Lawrence River, which makes it harder for ships to navigate and increases maintenance costs. And then there's shoreline erosion, which is a big concern. With less ice cover, the shoreline is more exposed to waves, which can lead to erosion and damage the infrastructure along the river.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Climate change is creating both opportunities and challenges.
Exactly, and it's making it harder to predict what's going to happen. Water levels are fluctuating more, which makes it tough for port operators to plan and manage the system effectively.
So you have this vital waterway that's facing all these unpredictable changes. And it's not just about the economics of it all, right?
You're right. The report also highlights the impact on First Nations communities who live along the Seaway. Some of them depend on ferries or single roads to get in and out, and climate change is making those routes less reliable. It's a reminder that we need to consider those communities in any kind of infrastructure planning.
It seems like we're seeing a theme here. We need to be thinking about these challenges in a much more holistic way. It's not just about engineering solutions, it's about understanding the impact on people, on communities, and on the environment.
I think that's a really important point. It's about the big picture, the interconnectedness of everything.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, literally from coast to coast to coast. What are some of the big takeaways from all of this? What should people be thinking about as they listen to this?
Well, I think the main message is that climate change is not some far-off threat. It's already here, and it's already impacting how we move around this massive country.
And those impacts are being felt everywhere, from small towns to big cities, from the coast to the prairies to the north.
Exactly. It's a nationwide challenge, and we need to take it seriously.
So what needs to happen?
The report is pretty clear about that. We need a coordinated national plan, a real commitment to collaboration, and a willingness to invest in making our infrastructure more resilient to these changes.
That sounds like a tall order.
It is, but the report also points to some really innovative solutions that are being explored, like using nature to protect our coastlines or shifting freight transport from trucks to ships.
And it emphasizes the need to learn from Indigenous knowledge and work closely with communities to find solutions that really work.
Absolutely.
It's been a fascinating deep dive so far, but we've only just scratched the surface.
That's true.
We'll be back soon to explore the report's recommendations in more detail and talk about what it all means for everyday Canadians. So stay tuned.
It's going to be interesting.
It is. We'll see you then.
See ya. Thinking back to those case studies, that funding issue really stuck with me.
Yeah, it's like everyone agrees we got to act fast, but then it becomes a question of, well, who's paying for it all?
Exactly. And the report kind of shines a light on this dynamic between the different levels of government,
Right, because municipalities own most of the infrastructure, but they probably don't have the cash to deal with these huge climate problems on their own.
Exactly. They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Responsible for maintaining everything, but needing help from the feds for the really big, pricey projects.
Yeah, it's tough. You can't expect small towns to handle a global crisis all on their own.
Nope. And the report actually has testimonies from mayors all across Canada, and they're all saying the same thing. They need stable, predictable funding to deal with all of this.
Makes sense to me. So it's not just about fixing what's broken. It's about getting ahead of the curve.
Exactly.
And that's got to be expensive.
Oh, for sure. But it's not just government funding either. The report also looks at the private sector, especially when it comes to things like, railways and airports.
Right, because those are often privately owned, right?
A lot of them are, yeah.
Yeah.
Or they operate on leased federal land, like airport authorities. So that adds a whole other layer to figuring out who pays for what.
It's a real balancing act, trying to figure out who's responsible for what.
It is.
But even beyond the money, how do we actually make these systems, more resilient? We can't just be reacting to disasters after they happen.
That's where the idea of proactive planning comes in. And the report really stresses this. We got to anticipate what climate change is going to throw at us and design infrastructure that can handle it.
So we need to move away from that fix it when it breaks mindset and actually think long term.
Exactly. Design things to last and adapt to changing conditions. One expert in the report actually talked about how we often design things to run lean, which makes sense if everything's going smoothly, but it leaves almost no room for error.
Like if a big storm hits, or we have a heat wave or flooding.
Yeah, exactly. We need to be building in some redundancy, flexibility, the ability to bounce back quickly when things go wrong.
And that's not just about the physical stuff, right? It's about emergency plans, communication systems, and a really collaborative approach to dealing with a crisis.
100% right. The report even points to that atmospheric river in BC back in 2021 as an example of how collaboration can work, even during a disaster.
Yeah, I remember that. A lot of different groups had to work together to get things back up and running.
Municipalities, Indigenous communities, the private sector, everybody.
So it's like a silver lining to a pretty dark cloud. It shows we can work together when we really have to.
That's the key, though, right? Bringing that spirit of collaboration into our planning and decision-making every day, not just when disaster strikes.
Okay, so we've talked about money and planning, but there's another big piece that the report really pushes: data.
Oh, data is essential. It's the basis for any informed decision. But when it comes to climate change and infrastructure, there's a big problem.
What's that?
We're often missing localized data on how climate change is going to impact specific places.
So we know that, say, sea levels are rising globally, but we don't necessarily know how that's going to affect a specific port or community.
Exactly. And Even when the data's out there, it's often scattered across different organizations, hard to find and use. It's like, imagine trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces.
So basically, they're saying we need a better system for collecting and sharing this data.
Yeah, a more centralized and accessible one, and more investment in research to fill in those data gaps.
Especially in places like the North, right? Where the impacts are happening so fast.
Right, we got to understand how permafrost thaw, reduced ice cover, and changing weather patterns are impacting the North's transportation systems. It's all connected.
It's like we need to really understand the problem before we can start figuring out solutions.
100%. We need good data to make good decisions. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that we often forget about.
What's that?
Public awareness.
Oh, right. Because it's one thing for experts to be talking about this stuff, but we need the public to understand it too.
Yeah, exactly. People need to understand how this impacts their lives and how their choices can make a difference.
Like choices about transportation, consumer habits, that sort of thing.
Yep, exactly. The report makes a big deal about education and communication. We got to move past those abstract ideas about climate change and critical infrastructure and show people how it affects them directly.
Right, like show them how those rising sea levels might make groceries more expensive, or how extreme heat can disrupt their travel plans.
Exactly. Help them understand that this isn't just some future problem. It's happening now, and we all have a role to play in finding solutions.
You know, what strikes me about this report is how it manages to weave together all these different perspectives. You've got the technical stuff about infrastructure, but you've also got the human stories, the communities on the front lines of climate change.
It's a good reminder that this isn't just a technical problem or an economic problem. It's a societal problem, and we got to tackle it together.
Which brings us back to the Senate committee's call for a coordinated national plan, right? Something that brings everyone to the table.
Yeah, governments, industry, indigenous communities, the public, everyone has a role to play.
And that's a perfect lead-in to the specific recommendations that the committee put forward.
Yeah.
They didn't just point out problems, they actually offered some concrete steps forward.
Right. They went beyond just the diagnosis. They're offering some potential treatments.
Okay, so let's get into those recommendations. What are some of the key things they're calling for?
Well, one of the most basic ones is the need for a clear list of what they call Canada's most critical transportation assets. You know, if we're going to prioritize investments and figure out where to adapt first, we got to know what parts of the system are most at risk.
So figure out where the weak points are, the areas where climate change could cause the biggest problems.
Precisely. And they suggest that the federal government should take the lead on this, working with provinces, territories, municipalities, Indigenous communities, everyone.
So a real team effort right from the start.
Exactly. But they go even further. They say that once those critical assets are identified, we need a real action plan to protect them.
So not just goals, but a real roadmap for how to actually get things done.
Yep, a detailed roadmap. And this plan needs to be developed in partnership with all the key stakeholders, government, industry, Indigenous knowledge holders, community representatives. Everyone needs a seat at the table.
And of course, no plan is complete without addressing the money issue.
Right. The committee is very clear on this. We need stable, long-term funding for climate change adaptation and mitigation. And it's got to come from both government and private sources. Everyone's got to pitch in.
It's about recognizing this is a long-term problem, not just a quick fix.
Exactly. And they point to some specific examples where that funding is needed most urgently. Like, they recommend working with municipalities and Indigenous communities to figure out the best way to protect the Chignecto Isthmus, you know, given that potential for massive flooding.
Right, that's a ticking time bomb.
It is. And they also want to see a detailed plan for addressing the specific needs of Canada's north, with investments in all-weather roads, port facilities, more resilient airports.
The North really does face a unique set of challenges.
It does. And the report specifically calls for more research to understand how climate change is affecting things like permafrost up there, which can have a huge impact on infrastructure.
What about Vancouver? Do they have specific recommendations for that region?
They did. Because of how important the Vancouver International Airport is, they recommend immediate consultations on how to protect it from rising sea levels and storm surges. And they also highlight the potential of using short sea shipping on the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway as a way to cut down on emissions and traffic congestion. But they point out that the current rules actually make it hard for different ports to work together effectively.
So they're saying we need to change some of the regulations to encourage more cooperation.
Exactly. Sometimes the solutions aren't about building new things, they're about changing the rules of the game.
Interesting. It seems like the committee is really pushing for a balanced approach here, national leadership combined with regional flexibility.
Yeah, they get that there's no one-size-fits-all answer to climate change. We need a national framework, but also the ability to adapt solutions to the specific challenges of different regions.
And what about preparing for emergencies? Do they address that?
Oh, for sure. They want to see a coordinated effort to make sure that all communities have plans and resources to deal with extreme weather events.
It makes sense, especially with those events becoming more frequent and intense.
Exactly. So the report lays out the challenges, but it also offers a way forward, a way that requires collaboration, innovation, and a willingness to invest in a sustainable future.
It's a path that we all need to be a part of.
Absolutely.
Now, we've talked a lot about the big picture, but there's one more crucial part of the report that we need to unpack.
What's that?
What does all of this mean for everyday Canadians?
Now that's the question, isn't it? That's what we'll be exploring in the final part of this deep dive. We'll connect these big ideas to the lives of everyday Canadians and give you some things to think about, how you can help build a more resilient and sustainable transportation system. Stay tuned.
All right, so we've talked about the big challenges, those recommendations from the Senate, and the need for a national plan. But, I think it's time to bring this conversation down to earth a bit. How does all this actually impact the lives of, everyday Canadians?
That's the key question, isn't it? It's easy to get lost in the policy weeds, but at the end of the day, this is about people.
Right.
I mean, transportation affects pretty much every aspect of our lives, right? How we get to work, how we see family and friends, how we get to the doctor, even the food we eat. So when climate change messes with the transportation system, it impacts all of that stuff.
Yeah, so it's not just some abstract concept. It's got real-world consequences.
Exactly. Remember that atmospheric river in BC back in 2021?
Oh, yeah.
All those pictures of empty grocery store shelves.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That was a direct result of transportation disruptions. It really showed us how much we rely on a functioning system to, keep things running.
And the impacts go way beyond just empty shelves, right? I mean, there's a big economic hit, too.
For sure. When supply chains get messed up, prices go up. So people end up paying more for everything. Businesses lose money. Production gets delayed. You even see job losses.
Yeah.
The report actually highlights that the Port of Vancouver alone handles over $300 billion worth of goods every year.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. So any disruption to that port has a huge ripple effect across the whole country, not just in Vancouver.
It's like one big chain reaction.
Yeah.
A problem in one place can end up affecting everyone. But it's not always about those big dramatic events like the atmospheric river, right?
Yeah.
There are smaller everyday things, too.
Absolutely. Climate change is also causing more of those smaller disruptions that we might not even notice as much.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, think road closures because of, extreme heat or flooding, flight cancellations due to bad weather, delays in shipping because of low water levels. They might not make the news, but they add up over time.
Yeah, they create inefficiencies, things get more expensive, and yeah, it affects our quality of life. It's like death by 1,000 cuts, right?
Exactly. You don't always see the whole picture, but you definitely feel it in your daily life. And I think that's really what the report is trying to get across. Climate change is already having a real impact on our transportation system, and everyone feels those consequences, even if we don't always connect the dots.
Yeah. It can be easy to feel overwhelmed by all this. Sounds like a lot of bad news. But the report also talks about opportunities, right? Like maybe this is a chance to do things differently, to be more innovative.
It does, yeah. These challenges are pushing us to rethink how we design, build, and operate our transportation systems. We need to get creative.
Like what kind of creative solutions are we talking about?
Well, one thing we're seeing more of is what they call nature-based solutions. Okay. Basically using things like wetlands and green infrastructure to help protect against things like flooding and erosion. It's about working with nature, not against it.
No, interesting. That sounds promising. Anything else?
Well, we're also seeing a lot more investment in electric vehicles and, alternative fuels, which can obviously help reduce emissions. And there's a lot of talk about this thing called modal shift.
Modal shift. What's that all about?
It's actually a pretty simple idea. It's about moving freight from trucks to more sustainable options like rail or marine transport. Okay. Remember that part about the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway?
Yeah.
That's a perfect example. Ships are much more fuel efficient than trucks, so if we move more goods by water, we can cut down on emissions big time.
So it's all about being more efficient, finding smarter ways to get things where they need to go.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about the tech and the infrastructure. We're also realizing how important it is to bring Indigenous knowledge into transportation planning. Indigenous communities have been living in harmony with the land for, well, centuries, so they have a ton of knowledge about how to adapt to changing environments.
Yeah, that seems incredibly valuable as we face these climate challenges. So it sounds like we're in a time of uh, a mix of challenges and opportunities, new tech and ancient wisdom. It's a lot to take in.
It's a lot, but the report does leave you with this feeling of hope, you know? It seems like they believe we can actually build a better system, one that's more resilient and sustainable, but it's going to take all of us working together.
And that's a good point. It's easy to feel helpless when it comes to these huge problems, but the report really stresses that even our individual actions can make a difference.
They can. Even small changes in our daily habits can add up to a more sustainable future.
So, like, what can people actually do? Any specific examples?
We'll start by thinking about how you get around. Can you walk or bike more? Take public transit instead of driving alone? Those are easy ways to reduce your impact. You can also try to support businesses that are doing things sustainably. Choose products that are shipped by rail or water instead of truck.
And just be more aware of how much stuff we're buying.
Right.
The less we consume, the less needs to be transported in the first place.
Exactly. And maybe the most important thing is to stay informed and get involved.
Yeah.
Learn about the issues, talk to your elected officials, support organizations that are working towards a better future.
That's what we're all about here at the Deep Dive, right? Giving you the knowledge to feel like you're part of the solution, not just a bystander. So as we wrap up today, we want to leave you with a challenge. What actions can you take, in your own life to help build a better transportation system? It doesn't have to be anything huge. Maybe start small, walk to the store instead of driving, whatever works for you. Or maybe it's something bigger, like pushing for policy changes in your community. Whatever you do, every action, no matter how small, helps create a brighter future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
See you next time.